Welcome to our next video, which will provide some helpful background information about Genesis 25 to 35, or Isaac's family story, and really the life of Jacob. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion I led a few years ago and is edited to provide you with the essential content to really help you better understand what is going on in these foundational chapters. So let's
When you
begin.
think of the book of Genesis, it's really a series of books, kind of like you think of like Harry Potter's like a series, a certain number of books. So is Genesis, and it's really divided by these different families. And so we're gonna first, after Abraham, he had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. So he highlights in 6 sentences Ishmael's life and just basically gives a genealogy, which is really important to highlight because as we think of what does that mean, it really demonstrates God's faithfulness to his people, demonstrated through Ishmael's life. And think of it that, Abraham, the man of faith, had this moment where he lacked faith and it resulted in conflict that's really embodied by Ishmael's life. And yet God promised to care for Abraham's family through Hagar and Ishmael. And we see that in 16:10 and 12. And, and so really through that promise, this is the result. And so it really highlights that simple point: God is faithful when we are faithless. And so I just want to highlight that that's part of the story. It's 6 verses that maybe you skim through, but really significant in terms of how the story is moving, in terms of he follows through on his promises. And then we're going to focus mainly on Isaac's family this morning. And so let me take just a few minutes to show you kind of the key parts to this story, and then we'll take some time to discuss it. And so looking at the timeline and characters, there's really 3 acts. There's the family drama, there's the exile, and then there's the transition to Jacob from Isaac. And so when you think about where we're coming from, before even Act 1 here, we we see in the first half of Isaac's life that it was full of God's providence. Think of the gift of the marriage with Rebecca and how important that was in chapter 24. Think of Isaac's faith, like when he was facing death, trusted God like Abraham in chapter 22, that climax of the story. However, as we come to book 8 here, the primary image, so not the only, but the primary image of Isaac, his character changes to an aging man who craves wild game, whose eyes cannot recognize God's leading, and he's unwilling to lead the family through their conflict. And so it's really creating a question, is the blessing done? This question we talked about, how, from the blessing given to Abraham to bless the whole world, how will the world be blessed through Abraham's family? Well, that's really called into question through the end of Isaac's life. So what's important, though, is to think, okay, what's the author wanting us to see? What's he emphasizing? And the book structure indicates that Jacob and not Isaac is the story's focal point. So when you think of how it's moving from Abraham, I thought we'd hear a lot more about Isaac's life. We do hear some, but it's primarily around Jacob's life. And it really gives a sense of hope. When you're wondering where's it going with Isaac, you start to see some transformation through the life of Jacob. So let's look at the life of Jacob, and I'm going to show you how the author broke up this part of the story. So when you think of how they use different approaches to telling a story, and I think in part too, it's an oral culture largely, and so they're trying to think through ways in that culture to remember these stories using the historical events, but framed in a way that's structured to remember. So they use what's called chiasm here, where you see some parallels from the beginning to the end of the story. The second part B, digression, Rebecca in a foreign palace, packed with foreigners, and then you see Dinah at the end. Jacob steals Esau's blessing, and then Esau reconciles. So you see this kind of progression that's moving towards this time of exile. that really is highlighted with the birth of all the kids. And so the main point is driving to just that, the fulfillment of the promise there, that God's working through Jacob to build this family. And yet we see in Jacob's life this constant struggle, starting in the womb, but a life that's built upon lies and theft and division. He's the last person that you'd want to model, especially after coming off of Abraham, who ends on a high note. Can you really imagine God, that he would bless the world through Jacob as we get introduced to Jacob? How does he, in his sovereign purpose, redeem humanity from a man who's just defined by theft and stealing and deceit? And yet, that's not the end of the story. God transforms him to become Israel. That's his new name, which for the Jews speaks to the beginning of their people, the Jewish nation. So this is how it's broken up, but let's just kind of conclude here in this first kind of overview of Isaac's family, 25 through 35. What's the main ideas here? Well, at the core of this story is God's promise of his protective presence. That's really the key, is you see over and over again how God engages this story to protect. So if you contrast it with Abraham's life, the big theme with Abraham's life is provision. And you see that how even at the end, when they're tested, Abraham and Isaac are tested, Abraham says that he trusts that God will what? Provide. And so we see a bit of a deepening in the revelation of who God is with this protective presence, and really ensuring the blessings passed to Isaac's family through Jacob. And so the promises which had called Abraham's family into being seemed almost lost in all the drama. You really see that the barriers of barrenness continue that happened in the beginning. Family strife becomes a major theme, and it's really exacerbated by self-determination, favoritism with the parents. And yet, at the most dangerous moments, God appears, and he appears to protect and to call again to Isaac's family. And I love that, because it really, in a sense, reveals how you can't silence God by the conflict, by what this family's doing. You can't chase him away with all the violence and the deceit. We see how God overcame the barrenness and the conflict to bring about his good purpose. And it's a beautiful ending of the story with reconciliation. And so this is really a story of God's sovereign good pleasure for the most unlikely of character, Jacob. And yet God is present, and he fulfills his promise for and protects this rebellious man. And so with the odds against Isaac's family, it's truly a miracle that God's promised blessing will continue. And you see just the start of the nation of Israel with the 12 sons that are born. And so really, when we go into from Abraham's life, Abraham just died. We saw that God fulfilled his promise to Ishmael. And then we come now to kind of the next major section with Isaac's family. Well, we really see the dysfunction. That's what it does. It's really setting the scene, and it's set entirely in Canaan. So we're still in the promised land. Abraham came back to the promised land and stayed there, and we're still there. And it really begins happy with the marriage to Rebekah. That's a high. And then it ends with a low with the exile of their youngest son, Jacob. And so he goes to Paddan Aram. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but that's the original home of Abraham's family. So as the reader's reading this, it's like, wait a second, we're not in the promised land anymore. Feels like we're going backwards. So it creates a lot of questions. And the first crisis is Rebekah's infertility, which mirrors Abraham's story. And in the story, though, what's different between Abraham and now Isaac's family is how quick it gets resolved. God answered prayer to Isaac, and it was like seemingly in just a matter of verses that the twins are born. And what's interesting, though, is it was actually a long time. It was about 20 years that they had to wait, which was similar to Abraham's amount of time of about 25 years. And yet that's not the focus of the story. And so that's why it's so important to see that it's not just a linear historical event. The Abraham's family had barrenness that they had to wait for 25 years for the promised son. Same with Isaac and Rebekah. They had to wait for 20 years, and yet most of Abraham's life, the story rather, is a story of them waiting. And we don't see that in Isaac's life. That's not the focus. The focus is their struggle, their family struggle. That's the drama. It's literally birthed with their twin boys who fight in the womb. They fight through the rest of their life for supremacy. And then there's this foreshadowing of God's unexpected promise in verse 23 of chapter 25. That's a key moment in this story. You might want to underline it. It's God's unexpected promise that the older Esau will serve the younger. And so in a culture where the firstborn is guaranteed all the father's inheritance, this promise was very confusing. It was conflicting. It adds to the struggle of what's going on. You just don't know what to expect anymore. And so that struggle is really the theme here. And it's caused and created by Jacob. He's not supposed to get the birthright. He takes advantage of his brother Esau's character flaws to take it from him. Esau's not without excuse. Sam, you make a great point on that. And so they're all responsible. But you really see that the primary character becoming Jacob, who deceives and then later steals Esau's blessing in collaboration with his mom, who would, and this is Jean, which I was thinking of, literally she says, I'd rather be cursed than to have Esau blessed. I mean, think of the dysfunction. That's her, like the mom who's supposed to be caring, who's supposed to be loving, and yet she would rather be doomed, not just die, but actually cursed than Esau to be blessed. And so it just highlights how dysfunctional it is, because the parents are totally disengaged from what's going on. And so I don't want to say that it's all doom and gloom. There is one hopeful break, a moment of calm in the storm in chapter 26 with Isaac seeking God. So in the brokenness, he's seeking God. Now, this is not the norm. This is an exception, but he does seek God. God speaks his promise and confirms it to him. But overall, the boys are polarizing agents for the parents. Isaac loves Esau for his game. Rebekah, and this is where Jean, this is where I think if I had to understand the story, why did Rebekah show favoritism? I think she knew the promise to Jacob, and I think she wanted to make it happen in her way. So it kind of represents a bit of what Sarah did with Abraham. But Rebekah loves Jacob for the Lord's promise of him to rule. But God's family is pulling itself apart. So how can the promise be fulfilled through them? That's the question that this raises. Well, I just want to highlight how the original author would see this, is when they read through Abraham's life, Abraham received a call, and then you go into the deception with his wife. There's quarreling. There's a divine reassurance with a sacrifice, a treaty. We see the same things in a shorter amount of time, though. So again, see that this isn't the focus of the story. The focus of the story is really Jacob. However, comparing Isaac, the promised son, to Abraham, the man of faith, in that short time period of one book, he also receives a call. His wife's, the wife's sister deception happens again. There's a quarrel with Abimelech's men. And then there's that divine assurance, God speaks, and a treaty. And so what that says is that we hold on to God's promise in 25:23, that the older will serve the younger, but it's confirmed again in 26. It just reminds us of Abraham, and that Isaac's God is the God of Abraham. So the God who is in the story of Abraham's life, and all of that happened, that amazing climax with Isaac being, provided for. He was called, tested, that his faith, Abraham's faith, and God provided with the ram, that we see that's the same God with Isaac's life. And I'm going to just highlight now the main part of the story, which is in chapters 28 through 33. And it's really transformation. So when you think about what we learned from Abraham, we learned about faith. And when we look at Jacob, what we learn is transformation. And I find that interesting because as we're, in the New Testament looking at the gospel, the main point of Galatians, as Paul is looking at the Old Testament even, he's saying that faith in Jesus transforms us to be God's kids. And so as we're looking at Genesis, the main characters, the big ones, Abraham, man of faith, trust in God, he will provide. Now we're at Jacob, a man, the last you'd expect is transformed. And so I think you see that same kind of reminder that we trust and God changes us, that we're seeing it even in Galatians. So God transforms Jacob through exile. He's disciplining him through conflicts with Laban and Esau. We know that because of exile is really known by the Jews as really kind of God's instrument for discipline. And so the ambitious Jacob, who prevails through his physical strength and what did I write here? Just the cunning, the thievery, he becomes the ambitious Israel. And you see him just praying to God towards the end, this humility in his shrewdness in dealing with people. So he becomes a changed man. Now, when you think of the story and how the Jews, as they're entering this land to become a new people, behind the plot, the narrator is developing this understanding that God prepares his covenant people to rule through even discipline and exile. And so it's kind of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to the people of the Jews. But the Lord elects his people. We saw that with Jacob, even in the womb. However, the elect who God chooses is unfit to rule as they emerge. And so the author is saying, be prepared for God. He's going to discipline his people when they run away. And it's so that they mature in their faith and become instruments of his blessing, which in this story is reconciliation. So Acts 2, though, when we're looking at how this is Act 2 is structured, you see the fleeing to the reconciliation, you see the angels preparing Jacob, and then the exile in the middle. And so God is intervening at key points as Jacob runs as a fugitive from certain death from Esau in the beginning, and then God intervenes with angels, and then he's running from defeat in exile from his own struggles, things that he did. Now Laban does to him. The angel shows up, and sandwiched in the middle is God's disciplinary school of exile. That's what God uses to transform Jacob into Israel. And so again, just in 28:10-22, God's intervening. He sends his messenger, the angel. And it's really to say that even in his sinfulness and weakness, Jacob recognizes the presence of God. You start to see that sensitivity, a level of spiritual sensitivity. It creates some hope that things could get better. And then in exile, we see two things. God provides. He builds Jacob's family with the bride in 29:1-14. You see the marriage contract in 29:15-30. And then all the kids, again, that's the emphasis of God providing. He fulfills the promise, providing the kids for the family of God. And then that key theme, not just provision, but we see God protect as the struggle builds. And you see that in 31:3, verse 7 and 29. It's really highlighted in the story. And I just think it's so important to see that Jacob recognized God's protection. Look at that in 31. I just want to highlight it. As he's fleeing from Laban, Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah, which shows leadership in contrast to the beginning of the story when Isaac did nothing. He says to his wives, I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me, his presence. You know that I've served your father with all strength, this Laban, yet your father has cheated me, which is irony. But verse 7, God did not permit him to harm me. So you see that theme over and over about God's protective presence. That's the key kind of characteristic of God that we see in Jacob's story. Now the exile climaxes after 20 years of trial. So you think of the comparison with Abraham's story, most of it's his waiting for God's provision. Well, in that 20 years, God's protecting Jacob through that trial. And this story I just read in 31 is the first time that Jacob emerges as a leader of faith. He acts promptly to fulfill God's command to return to the land. And then here, what I was just reading, he's bearing witness to his wives of God's presence. He's telling them about what God is doing. And so you're really seeing his leadership for the first time in 31. Took a lot of pruning and growing to get there, but he's now leading. And so then God, after that exile in the school of hard knocks, learning through discipline, God intervenes again in 32 to graciously prepare him for Esau. Jacob has to confront his past. And so God meets him. And really what God's doing is saying to, and I love this, this is so good, is that he's saying, before you deal with your horizontal reconciliation, you got to deal with me. And I think that's so true, that sometimes we get so focused on the horizontal needs, the brokenness in our world, that ultimately what we need to deal with, though, is God. And so God prepares him having to deal with God before he can resolve with Esau, first with the angel in 32:2, and he's reassured of God's presence. That's when Jacob prayed for the first time in 32:9 through 12. I just want to read that really briefly. I love this prayer. He says, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said, return to your country, I am not worthy." Think of this guy who stole the birthright, stole the blessing. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of your steadfast love and faithfulness. And this is so important to see this recurring theme of God's compassion, his faithfulness, his love in the Old Testament, because God's not a different God of the Old Testament. He's still a God of love. And he sees it. And so he says, please deliver me from the hand of my brother. And he knows that God will do good because of the promise. So you see a humble man praying, and man, what a different guy who's going back. And then in verse 32:30, we see the angel come, that theophany, that he doesn't know who it is. And it says that he saw God and he struggled. And so there's real transformation, that he becomes Israel through that struggle. And I think it's so important to see that, because that's really an example of what's to come for the Jews. As they're reading this, they're identifying with Jacob, just like you were saying, Rich. This is a guy that we can identify with. Now, all of this culminates, and then I'll stop talking, in chapter 33. And Jacob is the model of reconciliation. Here's the last guy we would have ever imagined that God could use, and he's the man that goes back and deals with his history. And sure enough, in verse 4, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, fell on his neck and kissed him. I mean, the transformation, not just in Jacob's heart as seen through that prayer, but the transformation now with Esau is beautiful. So you see that reconciliation, the covenant family, broken by lies, broken by division, broken by dysfunction. Jacob was transformed by God, not only to become a different man, but be a blessing to his family. You see peace, you see reconciliation. It's just an amazing story of transformation. So Act 3, that dysfunction grows again. So you kind of see that paralleling Act 1. But this is really the account of the transition, just like there's a third act with Abraham, the third act with Isaac's family, it transitions to Jacob. And so it's structured a Jacob journeying back to the land. You see all these sights and deaths that impact Israel's line, in that horrible story with what happened to the sister and the sins of Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. You know, their sister's raped and they seek revenge, not reconciliation, which was the highlight of Act 2. And so Israel now, like his father Isaac, was silent and uninvolved. So it's kind of a disappointing way to see Israel involved. And so his household similarly becomes more dysfunctional without leadership. And yet God appears to Israel, renews his covenant, gives him that name like we were talking about, Judy. And so God continues to be there for Israel, who continues to struggle. And it concludes with the death and burial of Isaac, which is to say the promised sin from chapter 3 continues to bring death. And then we move to Esau's family, just briefly in a chapter, and we see his descendants. And this is beautiful because in spite of Esau's unbelief, so not even a lack of faith or a struggle of faith, he has unbelief. His descendants have a future. And so under God, they have a story. It's interesting if you look at Deuteronomy 23:7, it says, do not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. So later on, as the Jews are becoming a people, there's this expectation that they see the Edomites, which are the descendants of Esau, as their brother. And I think it's a beautiful just kind of picture of, like you were saying, Rich, where things are going towards Christ, that even the remnant of Edom can be reconciled to his brother as a member of Christ's kingdom. And so God is faithful despite our unbelief and gives us a future. Now, the concluding questions: will the wounded victor promised in Genesis 3 come through Jacob's family? We have not answered that question yet. And then we have not answered the question from Genesis 12. And it's like, man, are you sure? I mean, really, really sure that God's promise to Abraham's family is going to work? Well, with God, all things are possible. He transforms the unlikeliest of people to become instruments of his blessing, just like Jacob. Jacob's kind of the Hail Mary of the family of God, where just the unlikeliest of moments, he comes through at the very end. And so